So friends, before we understand the anatomy, it is very important for us to understand the embryology of nose and face. Okay, the embryology of nose can be understood only once we understand how the face is formed. So let us study this topic, the embryology of nose and face, before we go to the next topic. Okay, now when we look at this, the face develops around 4 to 8 weeks of intrauterine life, and it develops from 5 different prominences or processes which develop around the primitive mouth we called as stomidium. Okay, so around this primitive mouth, as you can see, there are 5 main prominences. So what are these prominences or processes? Number 1 is the maxillary prominence. So it's a paired prominence, one on each side. You can see that's the maxillary prominence. Similarly, we have the mandibular prominence, that is also a paired prominence, one on each side, which forms the first arch. Okay, remember the mandibular arch is the first arch, and maxillary prominence is sometimes considered to be part of first arch. Okay, below that we have the second, third, fourth and sixth arch. The 5th prominence for the face development is the frontonasal prominence, which comes from above. So you can see the primitive mouth over here, and around these are the 5 prominences which have developed, and these 5 prominences, they will grow from all the sides to form the face. So let's look over here. What can we see over here? We can see the stomidium, the primitive mouth, and we can see that around it the maxillary prominence, the mandibular prominence, we can see they are all growing from the side, and the frontonasal prominence is coming from below. Now below these we know that there are pharyngeal arches, second, third, fourth and sixth. Okay, now on the frontonasal prominence we can see that there are 2 ectodermal thickenings. These we call as nasal placoid. So you can see one on each side, there is formation of nasal placoid. Okay, now what happens to this nasal placoid and how the nasal cavity forms, we'll discuss it. Now before we discuss it, let's look at this diagram. This is a color diagram of what we just saw over here. Okay, so this is the diagram. Now I've made a colored diagram over here. This is a 5 weeks embryo, and there is formation of facial processes which have already taken place. So what are these facial processes or prominences? Number 1, you see we have the stomidium over here, that is the primitive mouth. Around the stomidium we have the paired maxillary prominence, we have the paired mandibular prominence. Okay, we have the frontonasal prominence coming from above, right? Remember, below the mandibular prominence we have the pharyngeal arches, second and third, which can be seen over here, right? Now as we just discussed in the previous photograph, the frontonasal prominence, on both the sides there is formation of nasal placoid. So we can see the nasal placoid also clearly in this diagram. Now what happens to this nasal placoid? This is an ectodermal thickening, and what will happen? It will go in. Okay, as you can see in this next photograph, it has gone in, and when it goes in, it forms a nasal pit. Okay, so the nasal placoid converts into nasal pit, and the nasal pit is basically primitive nasal cavity, so the nasal cavity starts forming. Now around the nasal pit, what do we have? We have the frontonasal prominence. So around the nasal pit we have the frontonasal prominence. This frontonasal prominence, as you can see over here, it starts forming another thickening, a horseshoe shaped thickening. These are known as medial nasal process and lateral nasal process. Okay, so on the medial side it is known as medial nasal process, on the lateral side is known as lateral nasal process. Okay, so we have the medial nasal process and the lateral nasal process on both the sides. They form around the nasal pit, right? Okay, so we can see the nasal pit also in this diagram. What else can we see in this diagram? We can see the eye. As you can see over here, the eye has formed. Now anything else that is of importance to us over here? Yes, there is another structure, important structure that we can see over here, and that is the naso-optic groove. So you can see a groove is there Okay, that is known as naso-optic groove. Now this naso-optic groove will further lead to formation of nasolacrimal duct. Okay, and this is the place where we have the nasolabial cyst. So we'll discuss that in the diseases, congenital diseases of the nose. Right? Okay, so we can see the naso-optic groove also in this diagram. Now, let's go ahead and see what happens. You see, the maxillary prominence, it is growing from the two sides. Right? And this maxillary prominence which is growing from the two sides, it is coming and trying to meet in the medial. So when it is growing, it is pushing the medial nasal process. As you can see over here, these two medial nasal processes, they are being pushed medially by the medial migration of the maxillary prominence. So the two medial nasal processes, they grow and they are pushed to meet in the midline. So we can once again see the nasal pits, we can see the stomodium in this diagram, we can see the medial nasal processes which are being pushed by the maxillary processes, and we can clearly see the lateral nasal process also on both the sides. Right? Okay, now what happens? The two sides medial nasal process, it comes together and fuses and forms intermaxillary process. Okay, so it fuses and forms intermaxillary process. So intermaxillary process is formed by the fusion of two medial nasal process. Okay, so the two medial nasal process, they have come and they have fused and they form the intermaxillary process. So as you can see in this diagram, what will this intermaxillary process form? What do you see? It forms the tip of nose. As you can see over here, it forms the tip of nose, it forms the columella, the crest of nose, the base of the nose, the center, that's known as columella or crest, and it forms the philtrum. Right? So central part of upper lip, it forms the philtrum. Right? That is formed by intermaxillary process, or you can say the medial nasal process of both sides. Okay? Now, what is formed by the lateral nasal process? The lateral nasal process, you can see it has formed the ala of nose and it goes inside and forms the lateral wall. So you can see that the lateral nasal process on the two sides, it has formed the ala and the lateral nasal wall. The remaining of the frontonasal process, as you can see over here, the remaining of this frontonasal process, it has formed your forehead. Yes, it has formed your forehead. Okay, it has formed the bridge of the nose. So majority of the bridge of the nose is formed by the frontonasal process, except this part, the tip, columella and philtrum, which we have seen is formed by the intermaxillary process. Right? Remember, the frontonasal process, when it is growing down, it also gives a septum. It gives a process in the midline that forms the septum, nasal septum, and the nasal septum divides the nose into two nasal cavities. So the frontonasal process, other than forming this front of the face inside, it also contributes to formation of nasal septum. Okay, now let's look over here. The maxillary process on the two side, it has grown, it forms the cheek. Okay, so outside on the face, it has formed the cheek and it has formed the upper lip, except the central part, except the philtrum, the central part. Okay, so it has formed the upper lip, the cheek, except the central part of the upper lip, which was formed by intermaxillary process. Now, the mandibular process, it has come and fused in the midline. So it has formed your jaw, it has formed your lower lip. Okay, so that all has been formed by the mandibular process. So let's look over here, the development of face. Once again, we'll revise this. So we saw over here that the forehead and the bridge of nose over here, this was formed by the frontonasal process, as well as the septum, which we cannot see over here, that was formed by the frontonasal process. Okay, now the tip columella and the philtrum, they were formed by the intermaxillary process, or you can say the two medial nasal processes, means the same thing, which were in return formed by the frontonasal process, right? The ala and the lateral nasal wall, they were formed by the lateral nasal process. Okay, then we know that the cheek and the lateral part of the upper lip, except the philtrum, they were formed by the maxillary process. The lower lip and the jaw, they were formed by the mandibular process. Okay, so structures contributing to development of face, we know frontonasal process, it forms the forehead, bridge of nose, nasal septum, okay, as well as the medial and the lateral nasal processes. Okay, now the maxillary process, we know it forms the cheek and the lateral part of upper lip except the philtrum. The medial nasal process, the two sides, they combine and they form the intermaxillary process, and this intermaxillary process, it forms the philtrum, the crest, that means the columella, and the tip of nose. Okay, now the lateral nasal process, it forms the ala and the lateral nasal wall, right? And lastly, we have the mandibular process, which forms the lower lip and the jaw, right? So this is how the face is formed. Now, before we finish the embryology, let's look inside. What do we see over here? We see over here a developing nasal cavity. Remember, the nasal pit, it forms the nasal cavity, and we see the developing oral cavity, right? So we can see the developing nasal cavity and oral cavity, and we can see that they are fairly separate. They have been separated by a membrane that's known as oronasal membrane. Okay, so we can see that these two cavities are separate because of this oronasal membrane, and this membrane, it breaks down by 7 weeks of intrauterine life. Okay, so once this membrane breaks down, we have formation of primitive palate. So the anterior part is known as primitive palate, and we have formation of primitive choana. So this opening is known as primitive choana, right? Okay, and by 9 weeks, you see, we discussed about the maxillary process. The maxillary process grows from the side, okay, and it comes and tries to meet in the midline. It is not able to meet because in the middle we have the intermaxillary process. Now this maxillary process, when it is growing from the sides, it gives a plate of bone, a vertical plate. Okay, this vertical plate of bone grows vertically like this, and after some time it rotates, meets in the midline, and it forms the palate, the secondary palate. Okay, so the secondary palate is formed from the maxillary processes. They come and meet together, and you can see over here we have formation of this secondary palate by 9 weeks, and that leads to also the formation of definitive choana. Okay, so you can see that there is formation of definitive choana. Now remember, if this oronasal membrane does not break down, okay, so if the oronasal membrane does not break down, this choana will not be formed, and we will have a condition that is known as choanal atresia, right? So we will discuss this condition, choanal atresia, in the next topic. All right, also remember that if the palate, okay, it does not fuses, the secondary palate does not fuses, we'll have a condition known as cleft palate. Okay, so the palatine processes of the maxillary process, the palatine plates, if they don't fuse, we'll have a cleft palate. That will be hard cleft palate. Okay, or it can also be a soft cleft palate. Now, similarly, if the intermaxillary process, they do not fuse, the medial nasal process do not fuse, or the intermaxillary process does not fuses with the maxillary process, we will have cleft lip. Okay, so these are the congenital diseases. We can have a cleft lip. Okay, cleft lip can be on the either side or it can be in the center. So as I have shown you, it can be because of non-fusion of intermaxillary process with the maxillary process, or because of non-fusion of the two medial nasal processes which form the intermaxillary process. Right? Okay.